The wind on the ridge above Durango carried the smell of cottonwoods and cold water, and in the last gold light of a September afternoon, a woman stood at a fence line she had mended 100 times, and heard a man behind her say, quiet as a prayer, then I'll be the first. She did not turn right away. She let the sentence settle into the wood and the wire and the long grass, because she had lived 31 years waiting for a sentence to be meant, and she wanted this one to have the room it needed. She did not want to spend it too quickly. She had spent enough of her life doing that. That is where the story ends. This is how it begins. Ellie Rowan was 31 years old, 5 feet 6. With dark hair she kept braided over one shoulder and gray eyes that had learned early to look at the ground before they looked at people. She had come to the San Juan Range from a Missouri town so small the map did not bother with it, orphaned at 9, raised by an aunt who counted every bite of bread and every candle stub, and who had told her, more than once and in the plainest possible terms, that a plain girl with no dowry had better learn to be useful before she learned to be wanted. So Ellie had learned. She could sew a straight seam by the time she was 11. She could bake bread that did not need apology. She could ride a mule without complaint and butcher a chicken without pity, and she had learned to keep her voice quiet in rooms where louder people were talking. She wore a plain blue calico dress with long sleeves buttoned at the wrist, a high collar, a full skirt that swept the porch boards, and over it a wool shawl the color of old bark. Her hands were steady. Her posture was the posture of a woman who had been told, without words, that she was not the one anyone would look for. In the small ranching community of Silver Creek, 40 miles north of Durango, she cooked for the Callaway Ranch 3 days a week and mended for the church on Sundays, and she did both without asking to be thanked. Ethan Callaway was 34, 6'1", brown-haired, blue-eyed, with a jaw that had learned how to keep still through hard news. He had run the Callaway spread, 400 acres, 112 head of cattle, a 2-room house his father had built in 1867, since the winter of 1882, when the influenza took his wife Mary and their infant daughter within 11 days of each other. He had buried them himself in the small plot on the rise east of the barn, with the Reverend saying the words over frozen ground, and he had gone back to the herd the next morning because there was no one else to. He wore a dark canvas coat over a homespun shirt, denim trousers, worn brown boots, and a hat he took off indoors even when the room was empty. He was the kind of man who fixed a broken step without mentioning it, and who noticed, for years after the fact, that his own laugh had come back only in pieces. For 3 years, Ellie had walked the 2 miles from her one-room cabin to the Callaway kitchen every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. She left biscuits in the warming drawer and stew on the back of the stove, and she did not stay to eat. Ethan came in from the pasture and found the food waiting, and he ate alone, and he thought about her the way a man thinks about the North Star, steadily without saying so. They had never once, in 3 years, sat at the same table. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. The trouble that pushed this story into daylight was small at first. It began with a stove. On a Thursday in early September of 1886, Ellie came into the Callaway kitchen and found the old iron cookstove cold, and beside it a pile of stove parts laid out on a clean flour sack in the order they came off. Ethan was on his knees on the floor with soot on his forearms, and when he heard the door he did not stand up. He said, "Morning, Ellie," and she said, "Morning," and she set her basket on the table and looked at the parts on the sack, and she said, "You took the whole thing apart." He said, "The flu was drawing wrong." She said, "Since when?" He said, "Since a while." She knelt down beside him in her long blue skirt and picked up the damper and turned it in her hands, and she said, "My father had a stove like this." He looked at her then, and he said, "I did not know that." She said, "There is a great deal you do not know." And she smiled at the floor, and her cheeks colored, and she stood up and went back to her basket, and she did not look at him again for the rest of the morning. But when he came in at noon the stove was drawing, and the biscuits were on the warming plate, and the flour sack was folded, and she was gone. That is not the kind of thing a man forgets. The next Tuesday she came in at the usual time, and it was a Tuesday which she noticed, because everything of consequence in her life happened on days she was not expecting them, and she found on the kitchen table a small wooden box, sanded smooth, oiled dark, with a hinged lid and a brass hook. It was not a gift exactly. It was the size a woman might use to keep receipts, or letters, or a single lock of hair. Beside it was a note in Ethan's careful, blocky handwriting. It said, "For the recipes you keep in your head." It did not say from whom. She stood at the table with her hand on the lid for a long time, and then she opened it, and inside was the smell of cedar and nothing else, and she closed it again and set her basket down and got to work. She did not thank him that day. She did not know how. She had grown up in a house where thanks were a kind of debt, and she had spent her adult life trying to owe no one anything. But that night, in her cabin, she sat at her small table with the box in front of her and a tallow candle burning low, and she wrote out 3 recipes on 3 pieces of paper in her small, even hand. Biscuits, chicken stew, apple grunt, and she folded them carefully and laid them inside the box. And then she cried once, quietly, into her sleeve, and blew out the candle, and did not tell anyone. Some gifts are answered in the dark, where they can be received without witnesses. The town, of course, saw everything. Silver Creek was the kind of place where a woman walking home in a new shawl was news for 3 days, and a cedar box on a rancher's kitchen table was news before it was even set down. There were 4 women in particular who saw more than most. Widow Harriet Boone, who ran the general store and was 62 and had buried 2 husbands, said, "That Rowan girl is going to break that man's heart or fix it, and I cannot tell which." Reverend Pike's wife, Cora, who was 40 and had a laugh like a bell, said, "Ellie does not know she is being courted, and Ethan does not know he is courting." Millie Turner, who was 22 and newly married and considered herself an authority on love, said, "Someone ought to tell them." And old Mrs. Almadine, who was 78 and had run cattle with her late husband for 40 years, said, "No one ought to tell them a thing. Some things have to be walked into, not shoved." They said all of this on the porch of the general store on a Saturday afternoon in mid-September, while Ellie was inside buying salt and pretending not to hear. The obstacle, as the town would come to understand it, was not a man. It was Ellie herself. And it was also, in a smaller and gentler way, a young widower named Thomas Bell, who had a good farm 8 miles east of the Calloway place, and a 5-year-old daughter named Josie, and a manner so sincere and so patient that no one in Silver Creek had a bad word to say about him. Thomas Bell had begun, that August, to make Sunday calls at Ellie's cabin. He brought jars of honey. He asked after her health. He mentioned once that his daughter needed a mother, and then he apologized for mentioning it. He was 36 years old and lonely, and he was in every way the sort of man a sensible woman would choose. Ellie knew this. Ellie thought about it at night. She thought about it especially on the Tuesday after the cedar box, when she walked past the Calloway East pasture at dusk and saw Ethan on horseback in the failing light, moving cattle without hurry, the shape of him against the cottonwoods almost a part of the land itself. And she felt a thing in her chest she did not have a name for, and she thought, "I am 31 years old, and I have never been picked first for anything, not games, not choir, not a dance, not a walk home, and I do not know how to be picked, and I do not know how to stop hoping to be." And she went home and lit her candle and sat at her table and did not sleep until very late. And when she did sleep she dreamed of a fence line she had not yet stood at, in a light she had not yet seen. The first real physical labor as declaration came the following week. It was a Thursday. Ellie arrived at the Calloway ranch at 7 in the morning and found that during the night a black bear had come down out of the timber and torn open the smokehouse door, and had made off with a haunch of venison and a great deal of Ethan's peace of mind. The door was hanging on one hinge. The smokehouse floor was scattered with spilled salt, pale as new snow across the plank boards. She stood in the doorway of the house and looked out at the wreck of it, and she said, "Oh no." And Ethan, who was already at work on the door, looked up from his hammer and said, "Morning, Ellie," in a voice that was steady only because he had made it be. She set her basket down. She did not ask. She went to the smokehouse and knelt in her long blue skirt in the spilled salt and began to sweep it into a pile with her hands. He said, "Ellie, you do not need to." She said, "I know." And she kept sweeping. And when the salt was in a pile she scooped it into a bucket, and she washed the smokehouse floor with lye water, and she did all of this without a word, and Ethan stood at the broken hinge with a hammer in his hand and watched her, and something in him that had been held very tight for 4 years let go by a small measure. Somewhere out beyond the barn a cow was calling for her calf, and getting no answer, and neither of them commented on it. When she came back to the kitchen at noon her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and her hands were red, and there was a streak of soot on her cheek she did not know about. He came in behind her. he said, "Ellie," and she turned, and he saw the streak of soot, and he lifted his hand halfway to her face, and then he lowered it again and said only, "Thank you." She said, "It is nothing." He said, "It is not nothing." And they stood there in the kitchen with the biscuits between them, and neither one of them moved, and finally she said, "The stew is on the back of the stove," and she went home. That night, in his two-room house with the wind coming down off the ridge, Ethan Calloway sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold and thought, plainly and without ornament, "I am in love with her." He had not said it, even to himself, in 4 years. He said it now, and the house did not fall down, and he was surprised. He got up and went to the shelf and turned the framed daguerreotype of Mary and the baby a small measure toward the wall, not to hide it, only to give the new sentence room to breathe, and then he sat back down and drank the cold coffee and did not sleep for a long time. 3 weeks passed. The cottonwoods began to turn. The high peaks got their first snow. Thomas Bell called on Ellie twice more, and both times she sat with him on her porch in her long blue calico and listened to him talk about his daughter and his oats and his hopes, and she liked him. She truly did. He was a good man, and when he left, both times, she stood at her fence and watched him ride away, and she did not feel what she felt when she saw Ethan Calloway move cattle at dusk. And she was honest enough with herself to know the difference. But she was also 31 years old, and she was not fool enough to trust what she felt when the person she felt it for had never in 3 years said a single word about it. The second physical labor moment was quieter, and it was the one she would tell her daughter about years later. It happened on a rainy Saturday in late September. Ellie came into the Calloway kitchen and found that the small east-facing window over the wash basin, the one she stood at every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday to look at the mountains while she scrubbed, had been taken out. The frame was gone. There was a square hole in the wall, and through it came the wet gray light of the storm, and the smell of rain on sage. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with her basket in her hand and did not understand. Ethan came in from the barn with his hat dripping. He said, "Morning, Ellie." She said, "The window." He said, "I am putting in a bigger one." She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the square hole in the wall, and then he looked at the mountains through it, and he said, "So you would have good light." And he went back out to the barn to get the new frame. She stood there in the kitchen with the rain coming in through the wall, and she pressed her hand flat against her mouth, and she did not cry, because she had trained herself not to cry in other people's houses. But she stood there for a very long time, and when she went to the stove to start the biscuits her hands were shaking, and she had to set the flour down and hold onto the edge of the counter for a moment, and think about her mother, whom she barely remembered, and her aunt, who had never once told her she was pretty, and Thomas Bell, who was a good man, and Ethan Calloway, who had just cut a hole in his own wall so she would have good light. And she thought plainly, she thought, if a man will cut a hole in his own wall for you and never once say the reason out loud, then he has already said it, and you are the one who has been slow to hear. That is what love looks like when it does not announce itself. It just quietly faces east. The town chorus, as it happened, was not idle during any of this. On the first Sunday in October, after the service, Harriet Boone caught Ellie by the elbow at the church door and said, "Girl, that man is going to build you a whole new house one board at a time and never once say the word, and if you wait for him to say it you will die waiting." Cora Pike said, from behind her, "Harriet, hush." And Harriet said, "I will not hush. I have buried 2 husbands and I have watched 3 courtships die of politeness and I will not watch another." And Ellie, who had gone very pale, said, "Mrs. Boone, please," and walked out of the church and did not come back for 2 Sundays. The social pressure test came at the harvest gathering, the second Saturday of October, held every year in the meadow behind the Bell farm. There were long plank tables under the cottonwoods, and there was a fiddler, and there was cider, and there was the whole of Silver Creek in its Sunday clothes. Ellie came in her one good dress, a dark green wool with long sleeves and a high collar and a full skirt trimmed in black braid, and she stood at the edge of the crowd and tried to be invisible. She was not. Thomas Bell found her within 10 minutes. He asked her to walk with him down to the creek, and she did because she was a woman raised to be polite, and because she owed him at least the courtesy of an answer. They stood at the creek's edge in the late afternoon light. The cottonwoods were the color of new brass. Thomas said, "Ellie, I have been calling on you since August, and I have not asked you a proper question, and I would like to ask it now." She said, "Thomas, He said, I know. He looked at the water and he said, I know. He was not smiling, but he was not sad either. He said, I have seen how you look at the ridge above the Calloway place when you think no one is watching. He was quiet a moment, and then he said, my Anna, when she was dying, told me not to marry a woman who was waiting on somebody else. She said it would ruin 2 homes to save one. I did not understand what she meant then. I think I do now. He drew a slow breath. He said, I would rather ask a question I know the answer to than not ask it at all. So I am asking. He turned to her. He said, will you marry me, Ellie Rowan? She looked at him for a long moment. She was, in that moment, aware of every year she had spent being no one's first choice. She was aware of the box of cedar on her table, and the recipes inside it, and the east-facing window and the smokehouse floor. She was aware of the fact that Thomas Bell was a good man, and that a good man asking was more than she had ever been offered before. And she said, Thomas, I cannot. I am sorry. I cannot. And he nodded once, and he said, I thought so. And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, he does not know, does he? And she said, I do not think he does. And Thomas Bell, at the edge of the creek, in the last brass light of that afternoon, said, then someone should tell him. Not me, but someone. And he walked her back to the meadow, and he did not look at her again that evening, but he did not sulk either. And when he left the gathering, he tipped his hat to Ethan Calloway at the cider table, and Ethan tipped his back, and Thomas rode home to his daughter, and he did not marry for another 6 years, and when he did it was a widow from Pueblo with 2 boys of her own, and he was happy. And Ellie Rowan never forgot that he had asked her a question at a creek's edge and given her an honest way to answer it. That is a kind of love too. It just is not the kind this story is about. Ellie went home from the gathering that night and did not sleep. She sat at her table with the cedar box under her hand, and she thought, someone should tell him. But there was no one who would and no one who could, and she knew with a cold, clean knowledge that if this was going to be said at all, it was going to be said by her, and she was going to have to say it at the fence line, because that was the only place in the world where she felt like she had a right to stand her ground. She waited a week. She did her Tuesday and her Thursday. She left the biscuits and the stew, and she did not stay. Ethan noticed she was quieter than usual. He noticed that she did not meet his eyes when he came in from the pasture. He noticed also that Thomas Bell had not called on her since the gathering, and something in him that had been very still for a very long time began, cautiously, to hope. On the following Saturday afternoon, the 3rd Saturday of October, Ellie Rowan walked out to the west fence of the Calloway Ranch, the one that ran between the Calloway pasture and the creek that separated it from the neighbor's land, and she found Ethan there, as she had known she would, mending a stretch of wire that a steer had gone through. She had brought no basket. She was wearing her plain blue calico and her wool shawl. She stopped 10 feet from him and said, Ethan. He straightened. He set the wire cutters down on a fence post. He said, Ellie. She looked at him for a moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere out in the pasture a cow called for her calf, and got no answer. She said, I have to say a thing, and I have to say it once, because if I do not say it now I will lose my nerve. She took a breath. She said, Thomas Bell asked me to marry him at the harvest gathering, and I said no. Ethan did not move. She said, he asked me because he thought someone ought to. And he was right about that. Someone ought to. And no one is going to but me. She looked at the ground. Then she looked at him. She said, I am 31 years old, Ethan Calloway. And in 31 years nobody ever picked me first. Not once. Not for anything. My own aunt, when she was dying, told me I was a good girl but not a chosen one, and to make peace with the difference. I have been coming into your kitchen for 3 years and leaving before you eat, because I did not think I was allowed to want to be picked first by anyone, least of all by you. I did not come here today to ask you for anything. I came here because I would rather stand at this fence and say a foolish thing than go home tonight and not have said it. So there. That is the foolish thing. Nobody ever picked me first. She did not cry. Her hands were shaking, but she did not cry. Ethan Calloway stood at the fence line for a moment. He looked at her. He looked past her, at the ridge she had watched for 3 years, and then back at her, as if seeing both at once and understanding, at last, that they were the same view. And he took 1 step across the mended wire toward her, and he stopped, and he took off his hat, and he held it against his chest. His eyes were wet. He did not look away. He said, quiet as a prayer, "Then I'll be the first." She heard it in the wood and the wire and the long grass, and she did not turn away, and she did not look at the ground, and she felt, for the first time in 31 years, that she had been seen and chosen, not in spite of her quietness, but because of it. And she said, "Oh." And he closed the distance between them, and he took her hand. Not her waist, not her face, just her hand, the way a man takes something he intends to keep. And he said, "I have been trying to say it for a year, Ellie. I did not know how. I built you a window." He gave a small helpless laugh. He said, "I built you a whole window." And she said, "I know. I know you did." And they stood there at the fence line for a long time, and neither one of them let go. Behind them the sun slid another handspan down the sky, and the cottonwoods went from brass to copper to a deeper thing, and the ridge above Durango took on the last color of the day, and neither of them noticed, and neither of them cared. They were married 3 weeks later, on the second Saturday of November, in the small white church in Silver Creek. It snowed. Harriet Boone cried, quietly and without shame, in the second pew. Cora Pike stood at the door with a basket of dried rose petals and threw them at anyone who walked by, and hit the Reverend himself twice on his way to the pulpit. Reverend Pike, who was not a man given to sentiment, called it the plainest and best wedding he had performed in 11 years. Ellie wore her dark green wool with the black braid. Ethan wore his father's coat, which had not been out of the cedar chest since 1879, and which smelled, faintly, of pine and old paper and a house that had once been full. They said their vows without ornament and without hurry, and when Reverend Pike said the words husband and wife, Ethan did not kiss her right away. He looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at a thing he wants to remember exactly, and then he leaned down and kissed her forehead first, and then her mouth, and the whole church exhaled at once, and old Mrs. Alma Dean in the third pew said out loud, "Well, it was about time." The town chorus, satisfied at last, went home to their suppers. Millie Turner, walking out into the falling snow on her new husband's arm, said, "I told them so." And Cora Pike, 3 steps behind, laughed her bell laugh into the cold air and said, "Millie, no one told anyone anything. That is exactly the point." A year passed. Then, too, the Callaway spread grew by 60 acres. The 112 head of cattle became 140. Ellie planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, and she put up preserves every August, and she stood at the east-facing window every morning to look at the mountains while she washed the dishes, and she never once, in all the years to come, took that window for granted. In the spring of 1888, on an April morning green with new grass, their daughter Mary Ann was born. Named for the wife Ethan had buried and the mother Ellie had barely known, so that both of them would have a small place at the table for as long as the child lived. And she had her father's blue eyes and her mother's steadiness, and she was, from the first hour of her life, picked first for everything by everyone who ever knew her. And on a September afternoon many years later, when Mary Ann was grown and had children of her own, Ellie Callaway stood at the west fence of the Callaway Ranch and watched her granddaughter run through the long grass in the last gold light of the day, and she remembered a Saturday in October when she had stood at that same fence and said a foolish thing, and a man had taken off his hat and answered her. And she thought, plainly, "Then I'll be the first." And she smiled, because she knew now what the sentence had cost him to say, and what it had cost her to hear it, and how a whole life had been built on it, one east-facing window at a time. That is the story of Ellie and Ethan Callaway, of Silver Creek, in the San Juan Range, in the last brass light of a Colorado autumn. It is not a story about a grand gesture. It is a story about a man who cut a hole in his own wall so a woman would have good light, and a woman who walked out to a fence line and said the one true sentence she had been holding in her chest for 31 years, and a town that knew before either of them did, and a good man at a creek's edge who asked a question he already knew the answer to, and answered it well. Love, when it is real, does not need the whole town to witness it. It only needs one fence line, and one honest sentence, and one hat taken off in the wind. If you have ever felt in your own life that you were not the one anyone would look for, that you were the second thought, the practical choice, the person who was useful but not chosen, hear this. There is a kind of love in this world that does not announce itself. It does not stand up in a crowd and declare. It does not need a fiddler or a meadow or a speech. It builds you a window. It sweeps your smokehouse floor. It waits, patiently, for you to walk out to the fence and say the thing you have been carrying, and then it takes off its hat, and it answers you honestly, and it means it. And when it does, you will know, because the whole rest of your life, from that afternoon forward, will be built on that one quiet sentence, spoken in the wind, at a fence line, in the last gold light of an ordinary day. And you will not have to wonder, ever again, whether you were picked first. You will know that you were. Thank you for riding along with me today. If the story warms something in you, sit with it a while before you get up. Do not shake it off too quickly. Tell someone in your life this week that you see them, not for what they do, for who they are quietly when no one is watching. That is the whole lesson. That is the whole story. Until next time, keep riding. If this one found you, stay saddled. Next Sunday, I've got the story of a widowed schoolteacher in a Wyoming winter. A stranger who shows up with a broken wagon and a letter she was never meant to read. And the one sentence spoken at a woodshed door that changed the shape of both their lives forever. I'll see you at the fence line.